Welcome to another edition of Uncommon Engineering. Sit back, get a couple of coffees, maybe more than that. Get comfortable, get ready to be really, really educated from a man who's extremely, extremely special. Have known him since my time at Davis in '82. I really knew him as a professor and a father of two really lively boys who came into the sports shop where I worked at the time. But Alexander J. Groth is our guest, and a man that was born in 1932, Warsaw, Poland, saw the invasion of the Germans in his country, lived in the Warsaw ghetto, gone through fascism, Nazism, communism, an unbelievable existence from an unbelievable family, who makes his way to New York City, educated, and becomes a Yankee fan, makes his way out to California, to UC Davis, where he has an over 30-year career, a professor emeritus, has written multitude of books, multitude of articles, speaks all over the world on the subject of the Shoah and the Allies' involvement or lack of involvement in there. An expert on all kinds of isms, wrote a book on Lincoln. So hopefully we'll touch on all those subjects, and it could go a while. So please welcome to Uncommon Engineering, my great friend, Alexander J. Groth. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you. Very nice to be on your program. You're a dear friend.
Well, gosh, where do we start? And as I said before we came on, Alex, this is your story. It's really your story and your people's story, and what really people of today need to know or should know, or what can we take away from it? What lessons should we learn? Have we learned, or can we learn? And I think that's really the uncommon part about it, and what you've achieved as a father and a husband, and certainly a scholar. So take us back to the early days. You were 7 years old, I believe, when the Nazis invaded your country, and tell us a little bit about, if you can recall, your childhood, and really just your thinking, and what went through your mind when this first started happening.
Well, you know, I'll take you to my first memory, really, which was very important. I always used to talk about it in my classes at UC Davis. And that was when the Nazis defeated Poland in that first campaign in September of 1939. And on October 5th, 1939, Hitler came to Warsaw and reviewed a parade of Nazi troops. And the Nazis made an announcement. They use a kind of improvised public address system. And they said that anybody who would come to the window to watch the parade would be shot at. But I was 7 years old, and I got close to the curtain, the window in the house where we lived, on a street corner. And I was peeking through the curtain, and I was watching the parade. And this is very interesting because, you know, you can now see this parade with me. Any of our listeners can see it, because the History Channel and the Military History Channel replays it from time to time. But the difference is that I saw it in living color, and at the time, and from what I saw on the History Channel, they have it in black and white. And anyway, Dan wants you to know that the Nazis made an overwhelming impression on me at the time. Overwhelming impression of power, success, efficiency. They were perfectly matched. They were beautifully uniformed. They marched in terrific formations. Their weapons were glistening. And anyway, I looked at all of this and I thought to myself, nobody is ever going to beat these guys. That was the inference which I drew from this parade. And in a way, a lot of things followed from that. You know, by the summer of 1940, you know, and I think the exact date of French capitulation to Nazi Germany was June 24th, 1940, but right around that date, the adults around me, and I was 7½, they thought the war was lost. The war is lost. We are probably lost. We have to find some way to escape, get away. Very difficult. Maybe we won't be able to do it, but at any rate, it's just all down the drain. And it was pretty amazing that through simply great good luck, perseverance, what a lot of people did in different places, all of this was reversed. And ultimately, of course, you know, I was liberated by Russian troops, part of an army that eventually made its way to Berlin under Marshal Ivan Konev. It was Zhukov on the right and Konev on the left going to Berlin. And when I saw the Russian troops that had defeated the German army, I thought to myself, this is impossible. How could this have happened? These guys don't have the look of these all-conquering heroes, you know, that the Nazis did in October of 1939. But in a way, it's so very interesting that thanks to modern technology, that has become a permanent experience. So something that was such an important experience to me at that time is something that you and all of our viewers and the whole world can share in perpetuity. So that was the beginning of course, a very harrowing time in which the Jews of Poland became subject to what I call wild animal park rules. That is, the Nazis could and did whatever they wanted to do. And they did proceed to do it. I wanted to show you one interesting book, which might be a kind of reference. And this is, you can see this is the diary of Mary Berg. Mary Berg was a teenager. She was several years older than I, and I did not personally know her, although later I actually knew her father in New York City after the war. But she was partly an American, she had dual citizenship, American and Polish. And for whatever reason, they stuck these people in the Warsaw ghetto, and she lived in the building in which I lived, in the Warsaw ghetto, in 1940 and up to a certain time in 1941. And her memoirs first appeared in 1945 because she and her family were exchanged for some Nazi big shots during the Second World War. And they came to the United States on the same ship that ultimately 45, 6, 7, 2 years later, I came to New York, Swedish ship Gripsholm. And she wrote these memoirs from the very house that I had lived in, a kind of parallel. And this book has come out in many editions since 1945 and gives you a kind of idea of what life was like. And it's just one of those very odd things. And do want you to know that, again, another very odd thing that has happened is that, you know, most of Warsaw was completely destroyed after the Warsaw Uprising, which took place between August 1st and October 1st, 1944. and I was in it and was evacuated from it, and all kinds of things happened. But and Hitler gave an order to dynamite and destroy everything. But for some reason, probably because the Nazis were using it, the building where I lived, same building Mary Berg lived in, was spared. And so you could go there and go visit, and you could see the courtyard where I used to play football with other kids, or soccer at that time, at the age of 8 and 9. It was quite an experience. I got to see it in the year 2015 when we made our trip to Jerusalem. We stopped in Warsaw on the way. And when I saw it, I realized that the area where we played football was actually much smaller than I remembered it as a kid of 8 and 9. It was really quite amazing. But that's where we lived, the 4th story walk up, way up there, cold water flat, as it would be called in the US. And this was certainly one of my memories. And because Mary wrote about this, you know, this particular location is actually mentioned in the Warsaw Museum of the History of Polish Jews, which is a wonderful museum. I also visited it in 2015, and people can, you know, get an idea of what things were like if they visit that museum.
I know you lost your father early, and then you had a stepfather. Just describe those two men and their role and their lives, and really, unfortunately, their martyrdom as well.
Yes, Dan. Well, here I would like you to see a picture. This is a picture of my father and my mother.
Hold it just a little higher. Keep going up a little higher, a little higher.
Is that good?
More. There you go. There you go. That nice.
Okay. All right.
Nice.
You could see it. Yes. Well, you know, what happened in my family was that my mother divorced my father shortly before the war. He married another woman whom I actually met shortly before, because the relations among the people were amicable. And my father went with her to Krakow. And to the best of my knowledge, he was killed in the Krakow ghetto. How and under what circumstances, I have no idea. But the way it worked out was my stepfather was a physician. He was an ophthalmologist. And he had, before he married my mother, he had established a very successful medical practice in Warsaw, made a considerable amount of money which undoubtedly would have been considered hardly anything to talk about in the United States of America. But in World War II Poland, it was a lot. And because of that, we lived in an apartment which, by the standards of the Warsaw ghetto, represented sheer luxury, so to speak. I mean, it was wonderful. Small, cold water flat, walk up and so on. But hey.
How big would that be when you're saying it was luxurious there? Describe the size and the rooms in that flat.
Well, they were really very small. Probably the room that I'm in would be 2 rooms in that house. And, you know, I remember that they had to boil water in order to wash clothes, because there were no such things as washers and dryers and that kind of thing. That was all a matter of the future. And there was no, when you turned the faucet on, it was cold water. There was no hot water. But considering the conditions in the ghetto, that was really quite something. And a lot of our attention, especially my attention, you know, this is where I really developed my interest in what essentially is political science, that is thinking of international relations, keeping my eye on the front lines, west and east, hoping that Nazi Germany would be defeated, wondering how that might happen, worried about it, always following it. And one of the things, of course, that was going on is that we heard a lot, as everybody else in Poland did, from clandestine radio operators, people who owned radios. And of course, that was subject to the death penalty. If the Nazis found out that you had a shortwave radio, that might shoot you right there. But people did, and then they would circulate the information to a lot of other people. So for instance, during the war, I heard most of the famous phrases of Winston Churchill's speeches were familiar to me right in Poland during the war. One of them, for instance, was seldom, or actually never in the history of human, and never in the annals of human conflict, have so many owed so much to so few, which is what Churchill said about the RAF pilots who fought Nazi pilots in the so-called Battle of Britain in July, August, and September of 1940. And of course, we followed these events and these developments very closely. And our, you know, the tide of bad news really continued for a very long time. And it was first reversed, seriously reversed at the end of 1941 by two very important events. And the first event was the failure of the Nazis to capture Moscow. They suffered their first reverse on land, in land warfare. That had not happened before, but they did happen in any serious way. They really never did. But they did suffer a very serious reverse there. The story in Warsaw was that they already had posters prepared, and they were going to put them up on the wall showing a German soldier with a rifle and a bayonet piercing the symbol of Soviet communism, its capital, Moscow, conquered by the all-conquering Nazi army, that sort of thing. Well, they had to deep six those posters because they failed. And of course, the Russians launched a counteroffensive, which for the first time threw the Nazis quite a bit back and inflicted considerable losses on them.
That was your first glimmer of hope?
Yes, that was the first glimmer of hope. And I remember, Dan, that my stepfather, who was something of a pessimist, he was a very wise man and he taught me a lot of good things, but he was a pessimist. So he bet this man a jar of herring, which was a big deal in the Warsaw Ghetto, a jar of herring, that the Nazis would capture Moscow. And the other guy said they wouldn't capture Moscow. And my stepfather was very happy to give this man a jar of herring because they did not capture Moscow. And then Dan, came a wonderful, unbelievable date of December 11th, 4 days after Pearl Harbor. The Japanese came, they bombed Pearl Harbor, this was terrible. And Adolf Hitler, in a moment of complete craziness, declared war on the United States on the 11th of December of 1941, a mistake of enormous proportions, something which he, by the way, did not have to do at all, because when he attacked the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941, his wonderful Japanese friends decided that they were going to sit on their hands and they weren't going to do anything about it. And he could have easily said, under the same treaties and the same obligations, sorry, boys, we're not going to join here. But Hitler had these grandiose moments, which were insane, really, and this was one of them. And of course, that allowed President Roosevelt to make the European theater the principal focus of American interest after the war began, something that would have been completely impossible if Hitler had stayed out of the war. Roosevelt, of course, would have been compelled to defend America against the Japanese, and that would have been it. But Hitler did it. And I think that people around me, the adults around me, and I personally had the same reaction to this as Winston Churchill. And his reaction was, I went to bed thinking the war is won now. You know, whatever happens, the war is won. The United States is in, it's gonna be won. Okay.
Hope is a beautiful thing.
Yes, so that.
Tell me the role of your grandfather, Isaac, and I know you had spoken before, what an optimist, what a gregarious person he was, and obviously really the grit and resolve of your mother, just two family people, and how they served to help you, and what did you learn from them?
Well, my mother was a wonderful woman. She was a very, you know, I am very fortunate to have two very strong women in my life, my mother and my wife, Marilyn. And I owe a lot, I owe most to the two of them, so to speak, in turn. And my mother was really very tough lady, and you needed to be tough during those days. And I believe I mentioned this story to you that when I recounted her heroic conduct towards me during the war, on certain occasions, I did that publicly. And when I got back to my seat sitting next to her at that thing, she looked at me and she said, "Get over it," she said, which was typical of her attitude, very tough. And, you know, that was very...
What she's saying to you, Alex, day to day, like what were her messages to you?
She did well, you know, she told me things to do, and I listened to her, and she was a very smart woman, very enterprising, and she basically carried the day, although, Dan, which is this very important, you need to be lucky. Luck is extremely important in life. You know, this question of fortune, this is what it takes to survive. And in some ways, no matter how smart you are, if you don't have luck, you will fail. And no matter how, shall we say, vacuous you are, you will succeed if luck is with you. And fortunately for us, that was the case. You know, some of the life that I endured during World War II is similar to what is happening right now. Confinement in a house or an apartment without going out. Except that then the idea was, be quiet, don't go to windows because people might notice that you're there and wonder who you are. And if they wonder about that, they might think this is a Jew who's being hidden by someone. And if they thought so, they might denounce you to the Nazis. And the Nazis incentivized that kind of behavior by giving people rewards of money, bread, and preserves. And I believe vodka, for turning in Jews. So you don't do that. Do not jump, because people below will wonder what is going on up there. Is there somebody there that we don't know about, and who might that be? That sort of thing. So these were measures that need to be taken, and so you had to be quiet, and you had to move carefully, stay away from windows, spend time reading, talking quietly, that sort of thing. But that was the routine. And of course, hope that, that you could last it out. And for me, this lasted until the Warsaw Uprising of August 1944, because once that began, everybody went down to the basement. And of course, the Nazis started shelling all the parts of Warsaw that were occupied by the partisans, by the resistance movement. In some ways, it was a period that was kind of liberating because, people wandered from house to house, so nobody really knew who everybody was, kind of. And so you weren't so worried about, well, what will people think? They never saw me before, or whatever it is. And of course, there were no Nazis to denounce you too, because the thing was then under the control of the Polish resistance. The unfortunate part, and it's all very interesting, at that time, I almost lost my life because of the Russians who ultimately liberated me. But at that time, in August and September of 1944, Stalin, who was not known for his humanitarian instincts, was very upset with the, quote, pro-capitalist and anti-communist, anti-Soviet Polish resistance movement that was in charge of the Warsaw Uprising. And so he literally stopped his troops a few hundred yards away from Warsaw. If you went and visited there, you would see how close the area is that the Russians were in to where the main part of the city of Warsaw is and where the Nazis were. But he stopped his troops right there and would not help at all. And of course, the result was that eventually the Nazis defeated without all that much trouble the Polish resistors, took them prisoners. But, and this is very interesting, on October 2nd, 1944, one day after the Polish resistance surrendered, British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden got up in the House of Commons and issued a little declaration. He said that he would expect the German authorities to treat the surrendering Polish freedom fighters, or resistance members, as regular combatants of war and accord them the rights of the Geneva Convention. He didn't say what would be done if they didn't, but it was implied that obviously we expect you to do it, and if you don't do it, then perhaps something unpleasant might happen. And the result was that quite a few of the resistance fighters, including the leader of the uprising, General Tadeusz, what was his first name, Komarovsky. His first name was the same as Kosciuszko. Tadeusz Kosciuszko, Tadeusz Komarovsky, was taken prisoner by the Nazis and survived the war in a prisoner of war camp, went to England after the war, and wrote a very interesting book called The Secret Army in 1951, which is full of very interesting information. But basically, this happened because he was protected by the statement made by Eden. And the very interesting thing, which is part of another story that you also know, is that when the Jews had their uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto, which lasted from April 19th, 1943 to May 16th, 1943, no analogous declaration was issued and nothing was even said. And even though this was a public event, it was mentioned in the press, the Nazis issued a communique about it and so forth and so on. Churchill and Roosevelt were entirely silent, and nobody said anything about that, which was, of course, very, very disappointing, had grave consequences for what happened. And one of the interesting things that happened as a consequence was of this whole thing was the suicide of a man named Shmuel Ziegelboim, who was a member of the Polish National Council in exile in London, but who came from Warsaw, was Jewish, and he committed suicide in London on May 12th, 4 days before the Nazis issued their final announcement. And he left a letter saying that he's doing it to protest the passivity of the world and especially of the Allied governments, he said, toward the murder of the Jews. And of course, that was a very deserved statement then. And as far as I'm concerned, it rings through history and always will. So that
you've written a bunch about that, and I certainly want to get to that because I think, as our guy Malcolm Gladwell, it's a revisionist history topic for sure in terms of what we really know.
Yes.
I'd like to go back again to your grandfather because I'm always interested in the roles of parents and grandparents in raising their kids. And you had mentioned that he was illiterate, owned a grocery store, I believe, and just what you got from him and what his role was in your upbringing.
Well, he was a tremendous practical joker. He was had a great sense of humor. He was a wonderful man. I have very warm memories of him. I last saw him literally when we left the ghetto, which was, I know, sometime in August of 1942. I never saw him later, but he was in a way a heroic man. You know, he accompanied my grandmother. The Nazis executed my grandmother without putting her on the train because they wanted to save themselves the difficulty of dealing with people who had handicaps. And my grandmother was blind by that time. And my grandfather, according to the testimony of his son and my uncle, said, well, you know, I've lived with her all my life. I'm going to share her fate. And he went with her and was presumably executed someplace on the grounds of the Jewish cemetery in Warsaw, although we were never able to find the grave, actually. But anyway, so I have the warmest memories of my grandfather, a wonderful, wonderful man, warm person, a great man, ultimately heroic. And this is what we heard from my uncle. I did want to mention to you, Dan, that, you know, my mother did not live to see it, but it turned out that her brother, the uncle that I'm referring to, became one of the important historical voices of the history of the Warsaw Ghetto, something we didn't know. But he had a couple of degrees from the University of Warsaw. One of them was in linguistics and one was in sociology. And he wrote quite an essay. It's sometime in 1941 about what is going on in the Warsaw Ghetto. And that essay was found miraculously, still not known how, but it was found like the materials in the so-called Ringelblum file, which were put into a big metal milk can and were found after the war. And this too was found and then was reprinted in a book, which I have. I have it on my shelf.
There's a lot of books on that shelf.
Yeah, I have a lot of books on that shelf. But anyway, so my mother would have been totally delighted if she knew that this is what happened, that her brother made it into the history of the Warsaw Ghetto. And the title of the book appropriately is Words to Outlive Us. Words to Outlive Us is the title of the book. And I believe that the editor is a man named Michał or Michael Grinberg, spelled with a Y, G-R-Y-N-B-R-G. Anyway, quite an interesting essay. And you know, what happened was that we had, at that time, Warren went to the, my son Warren went to the Holocaust Museum, and would you believe they had a handwritten or pen-written copy of my uncle's essay there They made a copy of it and gave it to him. I have the copy at home, and I don't believe they even charged him any money. But anyway, it was very interesting. So there it is. I think anybody could get the copy of that essay by my uncle. And his name, of course, was Hasenfuss, which means rabbit's foot. That is what the name means, Hasenfuss. That was my...
there's some serendipity. So things get really, really crazier. Your mother decides we need to make a move here. So just describe that.
Oh, well, you know, it was all, you know, my mother got a pass to, she bribed her way, and she bribed somebody, and so they let her work in this German factory on the grounds of the ghetto, and they were making socks and perhaps other clothing material for the German army. And she was sitting all day folding socks, and she had a very big box in which she was putting it, and she had me hiding in that box, and I was 10 years old at the time.
How long would you have to be in that box?
Well, it was several days, but only several days, because after several days, the Nazis came and they said, Juden raus, which means Jews out. They were shooting automatic weapons up in the air while they were doing it. They had big German Shepherd dogs on leashes, and they were led by an SS officer. They were helmeted, and they conducted a selection. And of course, this was when my mother was most heroic, because she hung on to me. What she should have done is really tell me, kid, get lost, because you're not supposed to be here. And, you know, what are they going to do to me if they find out that I'm not following their orders? I mean, there's being Nazis. But instead, she was holding on to me, and we went up in front of this SS officer. And I looked very carefully at his face, and I was wondering what he was going to do. And I thought that he would do one of two things: either send both of us to the gas chamber, and there were a lot of people standing there who looked like they didn't belong in the factory, and we would be part of them, or he might be very vicious and send me there and let her go, which would also be very punitive. And instead, without really changing expression on his face, he was completely expressionless. He used his whip to let us go. We could go. It was an amazing decision which cannot be explained in any way. Not explain it. Well, this is when my mother decided, quite appropriately, that we were not going to survive very long in the ghetto. And so she bribed somebody else so that she and I and my stepfather in another group would join a group of Jewish workers, which would daily go to the Polish side of Warsaw and work in a factory there, and then return for the night to the ghetto. That's how they did it. And the thing about that was that the Nazis did not examine individual papers of those workers, but their procedure was they just did a count. 40, okay, 40. And I was at age 10, even though I never grew up to be very tall, I was one of those kids who grew up early, so that by the age of 10, I was probably pretty close to present size or so. So I just went with her, and we went 40. They let us go through. We went to the other side. And once we went to the other side, my mother called one of her friends, and we went to her house, and we began this process of hiding. So that's how that decision came about. And this is what inaugurated a 2-year period of basically hiding in different places, most of them in the city of Warsaw itself, until the Warsaw Uprising. And of course, after that, that was a whole other story, because they evacuated us and we went to a small village where there were a lot of other people from all over the place. And then the Russians came. that was that.
I believe I read that your mother carried a couple of cyanide pills with her.
Yes, she did. Yes, I remember those cyanide pills until the end of the war, and she carried them until it was all over, ready to take them if, quote, necessary.
That was her answer for you and for her.
Yes, yes, yes.
So talk about this, the run to the Swedish, was it a coal vessel? Is that right, what it was?
Oh, yes, yes. Well, that was another bribe. I don't know how she arranged that, but she did that. And the captain of a Swedish coal vessel took us on in the port of Gdynia, I believe, which is still there, of course, right next to the port of Gdansk or Danzig. And we sailed to southern Sweden. And once we got there, we went to a place which was being held by some Jewish charities, you know, which were very generous to us and various other people. And they kept us there. And we stayed in Sweden for several months. And I always thought that, you know, for me, Sweden was a cultural decompression chamber coming to the United States, because it was something midway between Poland and the United States. And if I had gone directly from Poland into the United States, it might have been too much for me. You know, then I remember that when we were sailing into New York Harbor on the ship Gripsholm, I was standing on deck watching, and I saw the name escapes me now, but you know, it's the major highway artery that runs from New York to Jersey. And this was 1947, and I looked out there, and there were so many cars there that I said to somebody standing next to me, is there a fire, do you think there are so, why are there so many cars there? I mean, who would have thought that? But anyway, so you get the idea of what a cultural shock it was. But in any case.
So you land in New York, and then we got a couple things going on. I'm interested in, you went to high school. I believe you're 15, right, when you hit New York?
Right, High School of Commerce.
You went to high school there, so just talk to me. You obviously didn't have a ton of education going on while you were in the ghetto, and now you jump into high school. You probably still speak only Polish at the time, correct? At that time?
I did speak some English already, okay, because, you know, in Sweden, I had some lessons in English from a woman who I think went to Australia later. But anyway, but she knew English, and she taught me and some other kids English. So I knew some, and we went there. And of course, the thing I need to tell you about High School of Commerce is that it was attended by and graduated from by Lou Gehrig, no less. Lou Gehrig,
serendipity,
pride of the Yankees, was graduated from High School of Commerce and then went to Columbia University as an undergraduate. Now, I went there as a graduate student, but I was there. And High School of Commerce, you know, no longer exists. It was raised, and the Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts has taken the place, has been built where High School of Commerce used to be, which I think was 65th Street and Broadway on the west side. And, but it was a very good experience for me, and I greatly enjoyed it and was very glad to be there. Later, I found out that George Gershwin briefly attended High School of Commerce. He didn't get a diploma from them, but I don't think he needed it particularly. You know, he did without it. It was okay. Yeah.
It was a hindrance.
Yes.
City College of New York, magna cum laude. Now, I'm guessing, I'm making an assumption that after all these years of not really having formal education, you probably just dove into this thing and really, really just loved the whole opportunity.
I did, you know, and I do remember, Dan, you know, the atmosphere at City College, what I would call the intellectual atmosphere at City College, was practically electric. These people, you know, were really into it, so to speak. And of course, we had a lot of very fine professors, some very famous, very good professors. And it was a wonderful school. And, you know, I have to mention this too, you know, this was a school that was attended by Felix Frankfurter, who later, of course, became a US Supreme Court Justice. And it so happened that the chair of the political science department at UC Davis, Professor Clyde Jacobs, was very interested in the work of Felix Frankfurter. And he wrote a book about Felix Frankfurter's judicial philosophy, and I think University of California Press published it. And he came to New York, and he went to Columbia University, and he looked at the file of people who were listed there looking for jobs. And he saw my name, and I had won the same medal as Frankfurter won, the Ward Medal of Government. In those days, political science was referred to as government. That's what it was. At Columbia, it was called at first, when I began there, the Department of Public Law and Government. That's what they called it. Later, it became all political science, but anyway. So really, I owed my job in Davis to the fact of this great coincidence. And you know, Dan, I think that this is one more proof, you know, how important serendipity and luck is in life, because that was an absolutely amazing turn. I had never applied to Davis. I never knew anything about Davis. And even after I had talked with Clyde Jacobs in 1960, he came to New York and he interviewed me. I really didn't know anything about Davis. I didn't really particularly even look into it. And if you had told me at that time that Davis is a suburb of Los Angeles, I would have easily agreed with you and said, that's fine, that's very nice, it's good, and so on. But when he came through with a job offer of being a starting assistant professor at UC Davis, I literally ran with my answer to the post office, mailed a letter saying, yes, I'm coming, because the whole idea of coming to California seemed to me so exciting and wonderful, and also, want you to know, completely exotic. The idea that I could be someplace close to a place called San Francisco was enough to just throw me for a huge loop, and
So let's go back to New York just a little bit here, because we got a couple of stories here. Talk to me about your first encounter with baseball, your first encounter with the Yankees, and had you had much exposure? Did you know anything about baseball when you were in Warsaw? I mean, was your first exposure in New York?
My first exposure was in New York. I knew absolutely nothing about baseball. I don't believe that anybody played baseball, and as far as I knew anything about it in Poland in my time. But you know what happened was when I came, I was, I guess, surfing the radio a little bit, different channels and so on. And for some reason, I tuned into Mel Allen doing a Yankee broadcast. And I listened once, and then I started listening some more. And before you know it, I started to get the hang of what was going on. And in April, so this is exactly, 70 years ago, Dan, in 1950, April of 1950, I paid my first visit to Yankee Stadium, and I paid a princely sum of 60 cents for a bleacher seat, 60 cents. I sat right behind Phil Rizzuto in the bleachers, and I was looking towards Yogi Berra catching, more or less. That's where I was aligned at. And I saw this game, and I want to show you a picture of my hero, Joe DiMaggio.
There he is.
See? The Yankee Clipper. Well, anyway, so this first game that I saw in April of 1950, Joe DiMaggio went 0 for 5. The Yankees lost, and they lost on a home run to the upper deck of the right field stand by Ted Williams. And that's what happened. 5-1, I think, was the score. But that was the first of many games that I attended there. Loved baseball. And you know that I hung out to quite a bit at UC Davis with Phil Swimley. Phil was good enough to let me sell a few tickets to his baseball banquet, which he had. And one time he even let me go to the airport and pick up Lefty Gomez. And I picked up Lefty Gomez at the airport, brought him to Davis. And I do want you to know that the first question that Lefty asked me when I took him, gave him a ride was, "Is there a liquor store nearby?" he said. So, but Lefty had an absolutely wonderful, deprecating sense of humor. And I know one of his best lines was when he said, "You know, I single-handedly put Jimmy Fox in the Hall of Fame," he said, you know. Yeah. And then he said, when I pitched, the Yankee infielders would go and say, "Why don't we get to hit against a guy like Gomez?" You would say. So, and when somebody asked him about DiMaggio, he said, "Well, every time I turned around, he was scaling the wall for something that somebody hit off me," he said. And so, anyway, he was a great character.
So how many games or how many years were you kind of a regular in Yankee Stadium?
Well, I was I was a person of limited means in those days, so I didn't go as often as I would have liked, but I did go with some frequency to games, and thoroughly enjoyed it. In many ways, it was my way of Americanizing myself, becoming familiar with American culture, getting a sense of things. I was there during the time when Professor Casey Stengel was the manager of the New York Yankees. And of course, he was a totally wonderful manager. The team was great. And it was just very, very interesting. I do have one baseball story that I would mention to you, Dan, which was, 1951 was DiMaggio's last year. He retired at the end of 51, and it was a year in which he hit 263 for the season, which for Joe was terrible. His lifetime was 325, and he finished, it was really bad. And I guess sometime toward the end of the season, I went to a game. It was a game with the Cleveland Indians, and Bobby Feller was pitching for the Indians. And apparently Bobby Feller did pretty well against DiMaggio generally. And in this particular game, somebody walked, somebody got a hit, and there was one or two men on base, and Yogi Berra came up. And of course, Yogi Berra was left-handed, and Feller right-handed. And the Cleveland Indians did something unbelievable. They walked Yogi Berra intentionally to pitch to Joe DiMaggio. Now, this is something that almost certainly never happened before. And I was sitting at the edge of my seat, and so were maybe 50,000 other people in Yankee Stadium, or 55, whatever it was. It was an unbelievable scene. Joe came up, and on either the first or the second pitch, Joe hit a ball 400 feet from home plate into deep left center field, into the Death Valley, as it was called, and he wound up at third base. And he was standing at third base, and I was looking at him, and the expression on his face was something like, did I remember my grocery shopping list this morning? Or maybe I left it at home. Meantime, the whole stadium is going totally bananas. People are crying, laughing, all kinds of things are happening. So anyway, I saw this game, and would you believe, years later, Marilyn's brother was playing golf with DiMaggio's grandson. And he told him the story, and he called me, he put me on the phone, and he said, you talk to this guy, he said, to talk to DiMaggio's grandson. He knew I loved DiMaggio. So I told him, that I had seen this game. And would you believe I got a letter from the Yankee Clipper, which said, yes, I remember the game, and so on. He certainly would remember the game. It was probably the greatest game of his career when you consider everything. But anyway, so that was good. Unfortunately, the ink on the letter has dried out, and I would have to have it, maybe I can have it scientifically redone. Marilyn says I still have the letter, but I think you can't read it very well now.
So speaking of Marilyn here now, you are teaching here, and there was a young lady, I guess, maybe in one of your classes that sparked a little more interest in political science and the Yankees.
Absolutely right. Look at this picture. I've got to show you a picture, Dan.
Okay, hold it up there, yeah. Oh, there we go. There we go.
Now, this is after we were married at Harper College in Binghamton. And I do want you to know that I met Marilyn on the 11th of November, Armistice Day. 11th of November. They were holding a little party. She was wearing a green dress, and I met her there. And I married her on the 15th of December. So that is, I married her within 1 month and 5 days of meeting her. I didn't really know her family to any particular degree or anything else, but I did that. It was a completely intuitive decision. One of the best decisions I made in my life. I would put it number one, actually, and completely intuitive. And I think what it shows is people underestimate, you know, the power of intuition in making decisions. Sometimes you can tell things without really, you couldn't even explain it exactly, but you see something which is absolutely compelling, and you do what you ought to do.
I'm seeing this whole Hassenfuss, this rabbit's foot thing. I'm seeing this resonate through your entire life right here. So I will no longer call you Alex. You will be Hassenfuss from now on.
I'll be rabbit foot from now.
You'll be the rabbit's foot. So,
right.
So how long have you been married now?
58 years.
58. So give all the listeners out there, you know, give us some knowledge, give us some wisdom. I'm getting close to 40 here, so give us the top to-dos and not to-dos in the Groth residence there.
Well, you and I belong to an elite club. Anybody who's been married 40 years in contemporary America is doing great, and that's just wonderful. Really, you have to be very lucky, and you and I have been very lucky. That is, I think, obvious from these years. You know, you cannot overestimate it. I know that some people say that the decision as to who you marry is really the most important decision in your life, and certainly could be.
I want to now get into a little bit of your scholarly work. There's so much of it for sure, but I want to backtrack again and talk about just the Allied forces and kind of the lack of maybe the appropriate involvement earlier. And gosh, we could be here for another 2 days, but you know, if you could, for the folks, just summarize a little bit in your mind, kind of the main points of, you know, when they really knew this was going on and kind of the failure to act a little bit.
Well, you know, there is you can certainly make an argument for democracy in terms of people's right to participate in their own governance. And I can certainly see that. That's perfectly okay. But from time to time, the argument is made that you get some tremendous benefit out of it. And I think the answer is it all depends on circumstances. And in the circumstances of the Second World War, democracy did not really work, did not work very well, really, against Hitler. And Hitler, who was probably as evil a man as ever lived, he was certainly one of them, nevertheless, enjoyed great advantages from the institutions of dictatorship which he imposed on Germany, although the word institutions is kind of ironic when you mention the dictatorship. But the idea, of course, that nobody in Germany could be publicly a pacifist in Hitler's time, nobody could really inquire as to what money he was spending and how he was spending it, what kind of weapons was he building, what did he have in mind? Was he planning a war? And if so, a war of aggression or what? Well, yes, all of those things, and he hid them very well. And he completely outdid the very stodgy, extremely hidebound Western democracies, Britain and France, of course, primarily. But the other smaller democracies are not particularly impressive either, because none of them thought enough to ally or to take steps which would compensate for what Nazi Germany was doing. They were all basically hiding their heads in the sand. And, you know, with the exception of Winston Churchill, of course, was a great exception. But, you know, one of the famous scenes which really caps all of it is Neville Chamberlain coming back from his conference with Hitler in Munich, arriving at Heathrow Airport in London, and waving a piece of paper saying, "I have Herr Hitler's signature here, we have peace in our time." Well, that was, of course, a complete illusion, but it was an illusion which at that time was cheered by millions of people. At that time, at the end of September and beginning of October of 1938, Winston Churchill was a man who was followed by about 5 or 6 other persons in the House of Commons out of over 600 or 630. Chamberlain was greeted as a hero. The French Prime Minister who went with him, Daladier, was greeted as a hero in France. He later recalled that he was very surprised, actually, because he knew what a rotten deal they participated in selling Czechoslovakia down the river. And what they didn't realize was that if they had stood up to Hitler, there would have been all sorts of consequences, one of which was that he might have been removed by the German military from power, because among the German military, the feeling was that it would be absolutely foolhardy and impossible and wrong for Germany to go to war in 1938, fighting a coalition of all these states, including Czechoslovakia, by the way, which had a rather modern army and substantial fortifications on its frontier with Germany. It would not have been a cakewalk. And the Russians at that time were interested, quote, in assisting against Nazi Germany. Now, God knows what they would have done, but in any case, they were certainly a part of the anti-Nazi coalition. Well, Chamberlain basically said, okay, you can, we'll go for this deal. And of course, on the 15th of March, 1939, he was proved a fool, so to speak, when Hitler violated his pledge he had given him. This is my last territorial demand in Europe. You give me this, I'll be satisfied. Well, he wasn't. Then he proceeded to occupy militarily Prague and Czech Republic. And at that point, people could see that Churchill had been right all along and Chamberlain wrong all along. But, you know, in a way, Chamberlain was far more representative of democratic public opinion than was Churchill. Churchill was really a man alone, as it's even the title of a book about him by the man who also wrote a biography of MacArthur. I'm suppressing his name. I'm having a senior moment here, but anyway.
You have so much knowledge up in there. It's just, it's totally forgiven.
Well, you're very kind. But anyway, so really the democracies were very poorly prepared. Militarily, they were completely outfoxed by the Germans. The Germans beat the living daylight out of them when the war began. The French generals were trying to fight World War I all over again. The Maginot Line mentality was all defense and no offense, so to speak. And Perhaps, Dan, in your sport, you would appreciate some really good offense, I think.
I'll bet you could teach me a lot about coaching, yes.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't try to do that, but in any case. So anyway, so all of this led to all kinds of calamities. And, you know, the British Expeditionary Corps essentially got whipped by the Germans in less than 2 weeks. The British, the Germans attacked in the West on May 10, 1940. And on the 23rd of May, the British were in Dunkirk asking for ships to take them back to England. And ultimately, of course, they evacuated around the 1st and 2nd of June. They were all gone. And they abandoned virtually all of their heavy weapons. So Britain had nothing but a bunch of riflemen to defend itself with, no fortifications on its southern border, 21 miles away from Hitler and continental Europe, in very, very sad shape. But fortunately, they were saved once again by the Führer himself, because the Führer, in another fit of madness, succumbed to his Bolshevik obsession. This was the Bolshevik Jewish obsession. He needed to deal with the Russians, who were the Bolshevik Jewish enemy of Germany. His view of the British was a highly idealized conception that they were fellow Aryans like the Germans. And his idea was that it was perfectly okay for Britain to rule India and places in Africa and Asia, and Germany would not interfere with it. All the British needed to do is give Germany a free hand in Europe, and they need to come to their senses. Well, they didn't come to their senses, so to speak. Churchill held out, and he held out at a time when things really looked very bad for Britain. I am personally reasonably sure that he could have invaded Britain and could have beaten them if he wanted to, but he didn't want to. And so this is the Battle of Britain, so-called, in which the Nazis lost many more planes, but not all that many more than the British. I think it was something like a ratio of 17 to 13 or 18 to 13 was the ratio of losses on the two sides. He simply gave up to it, gave up on it. And this, of course, immensely helped Winston Churchill, because frankly, if they had landed in southern England, I really don't believe that the British could have given them that much opposition. So the record of the democracies was very, very poor. And a lot of general propositions which are advanced, such as, well, in a democracy, you can access all the information you want, you can freely discuss anything you want, and therefore you will do all kinds of good things based on that. Well, it doesn't really work that way at all times. It may work that way at some times, but not in others. And in this very important case, it didn't work like that at all. The French had learned nothing from Hitler's campaign in Poland. They thought that what the Nazis did in Poland, they couldn't do to France, and they could. And the British didn't learn very much either. And the result was that they were all in very bad shape. And then, of course, Hitler made one of his, I think, two great mistakes. The one about declaring war on the United States was certainly one. And the other one was he should not have attacked Russia. He should have kept up after Britain. He didn't do that. He went after the Russians, and the Russians were vicious, and Stalin was not playing, a kind of game of indulgence with the Nazis. He gave them all the grief they possibly could have gotten, and his vicious methods, while they were vicious, like Hitler's, Hitler's very effective against the Western powers, and Stalin ultimately was effective against the against the Nazis, even though at great cost. But as you know very well, he didn't care very much about lives, and it didn't really matter to him at all that people would die in very large numbers, that they died in maybe greater numbers that they might have needed to under other circumstances. But that didn't matter. They did what they had to do, and they just simply overwhelmed the Nazis. Winston Churchill himself recognized that and gave them credit in one of the volumes of his World War II memoirs, The Grand Alliance. And because this is a very important statement, I remember the pages, 394 to 395 in The Grand Alliance is where Winston gives credit to the Russians for really beating the hell out of the Nazis.
He also, in his volumes of works, though, is that true or not true? They were quite large. No mention really of the Shoah. Is that correct?
No mention, no, absolutely, which is amazing. Not one word about the Holocaust in 3,000 pages of Churchill's memoirs, which were published in America, and they were published between the years 1948 and 1951. And this was after the Nuremberg trials, after everybody heard about the Holocaust and so on. Not a word from Churchill, and I think I would say guilty conscience is one explanation. It's a subject he didn't want to touch. What people don't know is that Churchill was the author of an article in 1920 in which he embraced the protocols of the Elders of Zion, a most anti-Semitic treatise, which was a foundation of Hitler's Mein Kampf. And the idea that communism and Jews is one and synonymous thing, and that the communists in Russia are really Jews who have seized power in Russia. Churchill didn't see Stalin or didn't see him coming. And I know I have friends who always tell me, you know, Mao Zedong was Jewish, they say. And they also say Chairman Xi is Jewish, you know, he really is. But it is an anti-Semite's fantasy, so to speak. But in any case, yeah, so that was...
And then there were also opportunities, right, for Roosevelt in the United States there early on, once we kind of had some intelligence about what was happening and a little bit of reticence to...
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you know, one thing which I will mention to you, Dan, is very interesting because, you know, I think a lot of these are stories really not about so much about Russians, British, Americans, Jews. These are stories about people. There were a lot of Jews around Franklin Roosevelt, including, by the way, Justice Felix Frankfurter, whose roles with respect to the Holocaust were abominable and whose conduct was abominable. And they all did it because, at least I certainly believe, they did it because they were careerists. They were people who had a personal vested interest in their relationship with the president. It was very valuable to them in every possible way. And they didn't really care a whit about ultimately what he did about this or that. And you know, in July of 1943, a very brave Polish courier whose statue is now in Warsaw in front of the Museum of Polish Jews, Jan Karski, was sent by the Polish government in exile. He visited with Roosevelt on July 28th and among other things told them about what was happening to the Jews in Poland. Something which Roosevelt knew anyway, but he did. And after he did that, he met Felix Frankfurter. He was introduced to Felix Frankfurter by the Polish ambassador of the government in exile in Washington. And Karski told him what he knew about the destruction of the Jews in Poland. And Felix Frankfurter said to him very famously, "I don't believe you," he said. And the ambassador said to Frankfurter, "Felix, how can you say that? You know, he's our courier and so on and so on." And Frankfurter said, "Well, I'm not saying he's a liar, I just don't believe him." Now, the thing you have to keep in mind is that the United States and Great Britain and Polish government in exile and various other governments in exile issued a declaration, public declaration on December 17, 1942, acknowledging the fact that they knew about the Holocaust. They knew all about it. They said Hitler is carrying out his plan of exterminating the Jews in Europe. This is what they said. So for Felix Frankfurter to say to Karski, I don't believe you, would be as if you and I had a conversation. You told me, you know, a lot of innocent people are being killed in Syria today. And I said to you, I don't believe you. It's not possible. I refuse to believe it. I don't know if you're a liar, but I don't believe it. I mean, it's absurd. It's absurd. But he did that. And another one who played a terrible role in all of these events and was Jewish was judge, of all things, Samuel Rosenman. Samuel Rosenman was sort of like one of Roosevelt's principal secretaries and even kind of chief of staff. In any case, he was an aide to Roosevelt, and he edited the 13 volumes of Roosevelt's speeches and public papers after the war. And in October of 1943, remember the date, October 6, 43, something which, by the way, you could still see on television along with me, 500 American rabbis traveled by train to Washington, D.C. to see Roosevelt and ask him for help for European Jews. And Roosevelt refused to see them and left the White House by the back door. And they eventually went to Capitol Hill and did speak to Henry Wallace. And there is a film which shows some of them talking to Henry Wallace. But anyway, what happened on that occasion was that Samuel Rosenman, his Jewish secretary, said to Roosevelt, you know, these people are not the kinds of Jews of whom I approve, you know. You should not meet with them. So that was the attitude that was taken. And there were various other Jews. I think Herbert Lehman, who replaced Roosevelt as governor of New York, was another one of those Jews who were close to Roosevelt and never said a thing to him. There's a little more ambivalence with Henry Morgenthau, but it's still not really very good. So, you know, it's not really so much an ethnic story. Some of the Jews played very terrible roles there, where, for instance, a man like Jan Karski was really heroic. He put himself in danger to go to various places to find out what was happening to the Jews. I think he visited the ghetto in Warsaw. He visited some camps. He made a dangerous journey through Europe to Britain and then to America and so on. But all of this was unavailing. These people were not interested. Now, I will say this, Dan, that of course Roosevelt's political base was New York. And, you know, for a Democrat to win in New York, he's got to do well in New York City. In Roosevelt's time, New York State had more electoral votes than any other state in the Union. And 1/3 of the population of New York City was Jewish. So Roosevelt was, in a way, quite sensitive to the Jewish aspect of things and did have a number of Jews in his sort of immediate political company. But his views were ultimately very unsympathetic, and he let his guard down one time, and it's in State Department papers, and you can read it, anyone can read it. And it happened exactly 1 month after the declaration of December 17th, on January 17th, 1943, in Casablanca. He talked to this French general, and of course his defenders say that he just tried to endear himself to this French general in order to make it easier to maintain American presence in North Africa, which I think is crazy anyway, but he made essentially a series of anti-Semitic statements saying that the Germans, he said, had justifiable complaints against the Jews. And he really should have said the Nazis had justifiable complaints against the Jews. And he then proceeded to tell the general how the Jews allegedly completely dominated German culture, represented more than half of the teachers in the German educational system, which was kind of absurd since there were only 600,000 Jews in Germany when there were 60 million people as a population. And so even if 9-year-old Jews were teachers, that still would have stretched it, so to speak. I mean, the whole thing was absurd, but that's what he did say. And of course, we also know what he did with Japanese Americans. And for that, we have a better record because in 1925, he wrote an article in a Georgia newspaper called the Macon Telegraph, in which he said, you can mix Japanese and European races or American and Japanese because you get terrible biological products out of that, you know. I mean, this is absolutely pure racism, that's what it was. And of course, it underlay his famous order of 1942, deprived Japanese Americans, citizens, in many cases born in this country, of liberty and property without due process of law. People who didn't do anything wrong were sent to these camps, you know. Well, that was unfortunately part and parcel of a very racist kind of outlook that he had. And so it's the case. Now, I do want you to know this, that I believe there is, of course, a certain paradox involved in it, and people should recognize it, and I recognize it. Both Roosevelt and Churchill played very important roles, and if you want to, you can even call them heroic roles in winning the Second World War against Adolf Hitler. Now, the question is, was that a valuable and important achievement? Yes, I think it was. Did they make great contributions? And the answer is, without any question, they did. So where do we go with this? Well, we have to appreciate the power of paradox. And the power of paradox is that sometimes people who may be, quote, good in terms of what may be called conventional morality, do bad things. An example of that would have been Chamberlain. I think Chamberlain probably never heard any other human being ever behaved illegally. He may not have had a parking ticket in his whole life, so to speak. But he made some very bad decisions which affected the lives of many people. Winston Churchill may have had all kinds of bad ideas. He played a heroic role. He kept Britain in the fight when it looked like all was lost. That was very important. Franklin Roosevelt steered the country through. You know, if you're going to give credit, you will give credit to Roosevelt for a lot of things. You give him credit for General Marshall, give him credit, if you want to, for MacArthur, certainly give him credit for Eisenhower, and frankly, even for George Patton. Because you know that after Patton had that slapping incident in Sicily where he slapped a soldier who said he suffered from battle fatigue and he called him a coward and slapped him, Roosevelt, as commander-in-chief, could have very easily objected to him being given any other command. But Roosevelt realized that Patton was a very gifted military leader, and he let him participate in the war to the great advantage of the Allies and the United States, and give him full credit. But on the other hand, when it comes to the Holocaust, these guys were bad dudes. That's what it was.
Yeah. I know someone, I don't know whether I watched it or read it, asked you a little bit about, you know, could you conceive of something like this ever happening again? And I think you had a little bit of trepidation. And I guess I guess really just with your unbelievable knowledge and, wisdom, I mean, what are we to know? What are we to learn? I mean, what are the signs? What do we take from all of this and moving forward, say, let's make sure this never happens again? Because obviously, like you said, we had some of this go on in Serbia. We had some of it go on in Rwanda. I mean, it's just man's inhumanity to man has always kind of really been amazing to me, not in a good way. But where do we go with all this?
Well, Dan, I'll tell you this. I am a great optimist in personal matters. Always have been, always will be, and I believe there's every reason to be optimistic. And I do believe that there are very good people out in the world. Mother Teresa was one of them. She was a very good woman. But when it comes to public affairs, that's another matter. And there I'm a lot less optimistic. And I think anybody who would read Machiavelli's book, The Prince, would be learning a lot about world politics, about politics in generally, and also even about humanity. There is a kind of semi-humorous remark which Machiavelli made, which I always liked, was he said, gratitude, he said, is a burden. Revenge is a pleasure. Remember that, when you look at human motives. So that what I fear, Dan, is that the things people do tend to be cyclical. What we did before, we may very likely do again. There are no guarantees that what happened before will not be done again on a similar scale, on a greater scale. When you think about it, think of all the genocides and all the wars that have occurred since 1945, including what happened in Rwanda. They did a genocide. What happened in former Yugoslavia in the 90s? What happened in Cambodia with the Khmer Rouge people killing lots and lots of people and so on. So I'm not placing any bets on these matters in the future, as much as I regret it, but those are some of the realities, I think.
On a more optimistic side, what are the chances the Yankees can get it going again? When we get to get it going?
Well, I am hopeful. I hope that Aaron Judge is going to come around from some of the injuries that he's had. And I am just, I was hoping that it would be the Yankees' year, with that wonderful pitcher that they got from the Astros, who was a humdinger, certainly last year. But who knows, Dan? I mean, I just don't.
I kind of befriended Clint Hurdle when I was in Colorado and when he was with the Rockies. And so I'm not a rabid follower of baseball, but I do kind of follow the Bucks, follow the Pirates a little bit. But Clint's an unbelievable person. And so that's my baseball fixer right now. Of course, I get to get out and see the Giants a little bit. Yeah.
Well, Dan, I absolutely have to ask you, what about Brady and Gronkowski in Tampa Bay?
Well, yeah, I think it's a case there where those two guys needed a break of scenery. Obviously, Brady, one of the greatest ever. I don't know. Of course, when I was here before, it was kind of Montana's show. So I'm kind of a Montana guy at heart, I guess. But I think it's a chance for those two guys to get back together. And Brady carried so much of the cultural burden there with the Patriots. I think it's good for him, just a breath of fresh air. I mean, gosh, been there 20 years, so it's a chance for him to – it'll be interesting to see how they put it all together. Much like you, I'm sure you enjoy, the political science of – it's funny, the coaching and the administration and the egos and the strategy and the groupthink and all those things. I think they're all the same. They're all the same. They're in our business, though, no one's shooting at each other. And we hope to score more points, but we certainly hope no one gets hurt by the whole thing. But it's fascinating to watch. We'll see what Gronkowski's got left. He's been oft injured here recently, but I'm sure if they use him sparingly, put him on third down, put him in the red zone, he'll be tough to handle.
You see, he's at least 6'4", is he, or 6'5" maybe? He's a big dude, isn't he?
Yeah, he's tough. He's tough to guard. He kind of just he had so many injuries and missed a couple seasons here the last few years, but I'm sure they'll use him sparingly. He'll be he won't be a secret weapon, but he'll be a tactical weapon, I think, in certain down and distance. And like I said, down the red zone, he'll be tough to handle. It'll be a tough matchup.
Well, if I lived in Tampa Bay, I would love to have tickets to see the Tampa Bay football team this year.
Well, I'm hoping that we do have football this year. On some level, I think we will. I don't know. It may all be pay-per-view and nobody in the stands. I don't know. You've probably been following the baseball scene a little bit. Do you think they're going to get this Grapefruit League going? Have you been following that much?
I'm hoping, like everyone else. I haven't really followed it that closely, and well, I would like to see them play, even if it's an empty stadium, but we could see it on television and so on. That would be good.
Yeah. When I was doing my ESPN rounds, I worked a few games with Joe Davis, who's now the voice of the Dodgers, and took Vin Scully's place. And, ironically, I knew he was super talented when I worked with him, did a few football games, and his dad was our spotter. And he said, he actually is better at baseball than he is football. And he had to cover some big shoes there, but yeah, he does the Dodger broadcasts. And so I kind of keep in track with him for a little bit. So I know you, are you starting on a new book here? A guy like you, it's probably like breathing air. You probably have to work on another project, huh?
Well, I'm still, I'm helping my friend Tony. You may remember him from the conference in Jerusalem.
Correct.
Putting together a few essays together with those that were presented in Jerusalem. So that's one project. And then, I wanted to show you, I just published, can you see that?
I can, yes.
Okay, I published a review here in this latest issue of this journal, and UC Davis gets credit because this is one of the ways in which they establish the ranks nationally and internationally for schools by tracking the scholarly activity of the personnel, of the people teaching. So
you are like Tom Brady. You're helping the rankings. You're helping the national rankings there of one of the great institutions in the country. Let me just talk about that a little bit. I think when you showed up here, there were 4,000 students. Is that correct? And
that is exactly right. Yes.
Gosh, could you just ever imagine the trajectory of UC Davis?
Unbelievable. Unbelievable.
Yeah, it's pretty phenomenal how we're so globally and nationally ranked in so many areas. And gosh, how
it changes. One could think, I think that this is like acceleration in history. Things now happen so fast. The scale, the magnitude of change is so great. I saw in the paper that UC Davis, now somebody was talking about 40,000 students at UC Davis. Well, that's unbelievable.
Yeah, it's amazing. I thought it was a hard time getting through campus on a bike when I was here. Now I can't even attempt it. I think you have to be a professional cyclist to make it through the crowd. So what's next on your agenda? I guess a lot of your life obviously is on hold, but have you got any speaking agenda alignments here in the next future?
No, I don't. I simply enjoy the simple pleasures of life. I hope that the world will reopen soon, and I could go and try some of my favorite local restaurants, for instance. That would be good. Get back to Starbucks. That would be very nice, hang out with old buddies and so on, and see how everybody.
Are you like, in fact, I have an Einstein book here. Are you like the Nobel laureates of, I know back in the East Coast, they all used to get together and hang out. Is that your deal at the coffee shop? You get all you knowledge power together?
We don't quite hit as high a threshold as you are implying here, Dan. We are a more lowbrow group, and Remember what I told you about tying shoelaces as being the topic, which we discussed. Now we just, we just visit, on a very personal kind of basis, and people talk about, their daily lives and whatever is going on and that kind of thing. And just hanging out is a lot of fun with friends, with people you like, what your family is doing, what's the latest on your son's this or your daughter's that, and so forth and so on, that kind of thing.
For the Aggie fans, what are some of the moments athletically that stick out to you? I know we were talking on the phone the other little bit about some of the Aggie footballers, but just looking back through your annals, what are some of your favorite Aggie moments over the years?
Well, remember, of course, Dan, the crucial thing here is that I'm 88 years old. So in the words of the famous song, I don't get around much anymore. That's the thing. But when I did used to get around, one of my great memories was, a game that you will undoubtedly remember. And I think Mike Komarovsky was quarterback, and those wonderful people from Lehigh came, and they played, and it was very foggy day, and I think the referees made some calls that robbed us, so to speak. Anyway, that was my opinion, which was probably a little prejudiced maybe, but that was my opinion. And anyway, and I remember then reading in the paper that the coach of the Lehigh team was interviewed, and he said, leaving Davis was a little like getting your tail out of the alligator swamp, which I like very much. And so anyway, those were things of that time. But anyway, so even though I can't get around as much as I used to, I still hope that perhaps within a reasonable period of time, all of these things will be lifted and we can visit and move around and do things.
Does the great Aggie John Patella, does he get you to some of the baseball games? Do you take in a little Aggie baseball?
Well, no, I haven't been to any games, really since Swimley's time. And of course, even the idea of visiting in Davis, a lot of things have changed. Marilyn and I used to go and do concerts at the Mondavi Center, but I don't like to drive. I'm afraid to drive at night. It's a problem now and so on. So we didn't reorder the tickets for this year, and that was even before anybody heard about coronavirus and so on. So, so it is a little different, but I would love to see the Aggies. And one thing I was going to ask you is, could we possibly have Aggie football on television? I would love to see them. Why don't the local station, KCRA or whatever they are, all these stations, KXTV, why don't they put on a little Aggie football? I would love to see the games.
We do have, Alex, some games streamed on this outfit called Pluto TV.
Oh, yeah?
Pluto TV. So, okay. Yeah, I'll have to come over and get you set up on that.
Yes. Oh, please do. Yes, I would love that.
I'll get you going. So they usually.
Listen, I would even love to see your practices if I could. Yeah.
Hey, we'll get you over there. I'll drive you over. We practice in the morning, so you might have a hard time with the coffee because we usually go about 9 to 11. So you would either have to go late to coffee or leave early or one or the other. So. But yeah, I'd love to have you talk to our team. I think they would get a lot out of you for sure. And gosh, I just really appreciate your friendship. And I've often thought about you so many times over the years as a student here, what an impression you made on me and just what an optimist you are and such a humble person and really so accomplished, and really glad that you could get on here and share so much knowledge really of a time that I think maybe now people think was back in the dinosaur days, but it sure wasn't. But so much knowledge, so much humility, and what an amazing story, and certainly an uncommon existence for you.
Dan, you're a wonderful friend, a great leader. I admire you tremendously. I think you have a lot of qualities of Jim Soker. There are guys who have sparks coming off them, and you are one of those guys. And that is what makes a leader. I think in a way you are the George Patton, and he was the George Patton of that game. You know, people, I do. And I think it's a mix of various things, including great affection, really, or love, which promotes effort on the part of athletes for their leader, their coach, and this is true of you as it was of Soker. And so I am honored to be a friend of yours, and I hope we'll still have many good occasions together.
I'm going to plant a seed of a book here. I think your crossover between sports and political science and leadership, I'll bet you could write a tremendously interesting correlation. I think that people on both sides or all sides could get a lot of. So mold that one around a little bit. That could be your next project.
Okay. It'll be you and Soker in my book.
I'll be on the way back.
No.
Well, hey, Alex, this has really been great, really inspirational, really informative. And like I said, I just love you a lot and your family, and really treasure your experience. So
thank you so much.
Thank you so much. All right.
Thank you. Wonderful. Yes. Goodbye. Wonderful.